Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll get started here in about a minute at the top of the hour. Thanks so much. All right, let's go on ahead and let's get started, everybody. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Human Performance Modeling Technical Group webinar, Computational Models of Human Performance, an Algebraic Equation Approach. Before we begin, a few announcements. This is a Zoom webinar. You will be able to see our panelists, but they cannot see you. If you want to submit any questions during the webinar for our panelists, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions at any time. Our moderator will be conducting the Q&A at the end of the session. I also want to remind you that we have real-time captioning available for today's session. To use this feature, choose the closed caption or live transcript option in your Zoom toolbar. Thank you again for joining us. I'm going to pass it on to our moderator, Jiyun Kim, to get us started. Jiyun?
Hello everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. I'm Jian Kim. I'm the chair of this Human Performance Modeling Technical Group. And during the conference last year in Chicago and the TG business meeting, many members expressed their interest in this webinar as future event. So I'm so pleased to introduce our first webinar from our TG with Dr. Chris Wickens. So Dr. Wickens is a research professor of psychology at Colorado State University, and he received his PhD from University of Michigan, and he was a former professor of psychology in mechanical engineering and aviation at the University of Illinois. So to name a few of his long listing records, so he has authored and co-authored 3 textbooks in human factors and engineering psychology, and he has published over 300 articles in peer-reviewed journal and book chapters focusing on especially in developing computational models of human attention in applied settings. So his webinar is about all about these computational models of human performance. And that's all about the introduction. And for about 45 to 50 minutes of webinar, you can just enjoy the webinar. And then if you have questions, please leave your questions in the Q&A. Then we will have a Q&A sessions afterwards. So please welcome Dr. Chris Wickens.
Okay, Gian, thank you very much for the introduction. And Stephanie, thank you very much for the organization that went behind this. So this is the title of my talk, and I want to begin this by saying this is really a tribute to 2 scholars in our field, Eli Liu, who I'm sure many of you know for his work on modeling, who passed away shortly after the meeting of human factors, and Dick Pugh, who was my advisor at University of Michigan, and he also sadly passed away. So both of them have had a tremendous influence on my approach to modeling and to human performance in general. I don't know if I mentioned, yeah, Ely was my student, one of my first PhD students at University of Illinois. So let me launch into the talk by sort of introducing or contrasting my approach to what is more the traditional approach to computational cognitive modeling, such as the ACT-R or the NPQ model developed by Ely. And this approach focuses on modeling the cognitive processes. It often addresses the time and the sequence of mental operations. A typical cognitive model of this sort runs on a digital computer through a discrete event simulation. And these types of models were not explicitly designed for human factors applications, but more to contribute to the basic theory of how the brain operates and can we model this in a computer process. My complementary approach is to develop computational human performance models, and I emphasize performance. An example of this is Paul Fitz's model of movement time, where we're trying to look at parameters of a control station that influence how long it takes to move from a starting point to a target. The emphasis of the performance models is on the performance product of the information processing. Emphasis is on the product more so than on the process. And the key thing in my approach is this measure of performance, which can be basically modeled on a scale, which is better and worse. And the fact that we can scale the output in terms of better or worse has great relevance for the human factors community in design. Okay. So, a little bit more to elaborate my approach, it's to develop fairly simple linear algebraic equations that can be used on a calculator. Doesn't require a lot of computational power. The concept is that some measure of performance can be equal to a linear equation, algebraic equation, with the sum of terms, AA, BB, CC. And I'll describe what those terms are in a little moment. And the model performance output is one that designers can use to balance the performance gains or losses against the dollar cost of implementing these some change in a system. And I provide, these are two very brief examples, but I will be elaborating on them later in the presentation. We can look at the gain in productivity against the cost to performance from adding another task to a pilot's responsibility. And to look at this trade-off and particularly find out the cost to performance of having to multitask, we can adapt a multitasking model such as the multiple resource model used to predict the cost to performance when asking people to perform two tasks at the same time relative to each task in isolation. And this was an early application of modeling that our team was asked to do a number of times by, for example, the Air Force that would want to give yet the pilot of a fighter jet another task to perform to increase productivity. But how much would that hurt performance? The second example is the gain in performance accuracy versus the cost of equipment that is imposed when we shift a display from simply leaving on a vehicle dashboard to moving it up to a head-mounted display. In general, we argue there's an advantage to have such model predictions available before a product is gone into implementation or production. And I think those of us, all of us in the technical group who advocates modeling, realize this is a real important purpose of models for human performance. In addition, I'll argue and show how the way in which models can incorporate and predict human performance trade-offs when one variable in a system is traded off against another. Okay. So the notion I've said before is the model is performance is equal to the sum of two or more different terms. Each term is defined by a factor. For example, how many tasks are we performing, or what are the difficulty of the tasks, and a weighting that determines how much each factor contributes to the overall performance. And the simple example that I introduced before, the multiple resource model, is used to predict multitasking performance, or the decrement in a task from doing them at the same time relative to each task done by itself. And in this model, we predict the decrement of performance, the dual task decrement, is equal to term A, which represents the resource demanded by the task. Is it an easy or hard task? And we can always scale this on some sort of index like the NASA TLX index. Plus B, this second term, is the degree of resource conflict between two tasks. Do they demand the same resources within the processing system, like both being visual tasks? Or do they demand separate resources, like one task being visual, the other task being auditory? In another publication, and I've given reference to these publications below, we can compute specific numerical values of each of these costs. We can determine the relative weighting. Is it more important to keep tasks easy, or is it more important to use separate resources? So we can determine the relative weighting of these two components. And then this model output can be used by designers to decide, for example, whether it's worth the cost of installing a voice display processed auditorially to replace or to perhaps augment a visual display while the operator is also driving a vehicle, which is a highly visual task. Well, a generic question that we always ask is, where do these important weights come from? How do I know that A term is weighted more than a B term? And there are really three sources of evidence that we use to draw the weights from. We can run a single multi-factor experiment, for example, a single experiment in time sharing that looks at both how hard the tasks are and whether they compete for shared versus separate resources. And we can compare the effect size, the eta squareds, of those two factors. For continuous variables, we can use a multilinear regressions to predict the performance, and then we can compare the beta weights of the different terms. And finally, from a meta-analysis, and I'll talk a lot about these later on, we can do a meta-analysis. We can compare the mean D-scores, effect size, across many variables as reflected by many different experiments. I'm a big fan of meta-analyses to help populate these coefficients in computational models. So what I present here is kind of like the ideal prototype of a modeling sequence where the modeler, we can first identify key choices that a designer might want to make. For example, to use an auditory or visual display, or a head-mounted display versus a head-down tablet. We do experiments, and/or we perform a meta-analysis. Out of this, we can develop the model, our different terms and the weightings. Critically, then, we're going to try to evaluate or validate the model by doing an experiment where multiple factors are manipulated. We'll check the validation of the model from the outputs of our experiments. I'll show a slide on this in the next slide. If that validation is not sufficient, that is, we've got a relatively low correlation between what the model predicts and the performance output is, we'll go back and refine the model and repeat the cycle. But if our correlation is high enough between prediction and obtained performance, then we'll go out and we'll try to sell the model to a contractor or to the public and so forth. As we know, to be useful and valuable in real-world prediction, the models need to be valid. And my approach to computational model validation is a correlational one, in which we look at, for example, across 4 different display configurations, how well does the model predict the level of performance? We do the experiment, we find out what the level of performance actually is, and we'll simply look at a correlation between prediction and obtain, and hopefully all of these points will lie across a nice function, and the correlation will be high, and not necessarily 1, but a high to be valuable. I want to emphasize here that the significance of the correlation in these analyses does not really matter that much, because so much of significance is determined by the sample size. And in this case, the sample size is low. We're probably not going to get significance. But what matters is the value of the correlation that tells us how closely these points lie to a straight diagonal line. Models can vary in their complexity. We have a single factor model, such as a model of warning light um, detection. We want to know how much shortening of a peripheral response time do you get by raising the intensity of a warning light that's moved to the periphery. And the question, how much, is not whether it's significant, but what is the actual correlation coefficient for performance as a function of intensity? We have multi-factor models, such as the multiple resource model that I described very briefly above. And when we have multi-factor models, sometimes we're interested in whether the factors interact with each other such that there's an interaction term and the effect of one variable is amplified or attenuated by the effect of the other. We have a sleep disruption model that says the effect of sleep deprivation is a lot greater in the nighttime than during the daytime. So what I'll do for the rest of the talk is present 10 different examples of computational human performance prediction models. 2 of these will not be related to attention, a model of mental rotation and a model of sleep disruption. I will talk in some detail about 5 models of attention, because attention, as you probably know, is close to my heart. And then finally conclude with 3 models of human automation interaction. This is kind of the table that I'm using to represent the sequence of models in our talk. These first 2 represent non-attention models, and then we'll talk about a series of attention models, and I'll go into each of these. Very briefly, I've discussed only briefly the sleep disruption model, the multiple resource model. I'm not going to cover what's called a strategic task overload model of attention task switching, but I will be zooming in considerable detail on the models of visual scanning and neglect, visual noticing and change blindness, and performance with separated versus overlaid displays. And following this, then I'm going to talk in some detail about 3 models of human automation interaction: a model of alert reliability, the automation design advisory tool for flight deck automation, and a more generic model of human automation team performance. So let me now zoom in on some of these models in more detail to show how they operate and what their terms are. So the first of these is the sieve model of visual scanning, essentially modeling or predicting how the eyeball moves around a workspace to examine different displays or areas of interest. Here's an example of looking at the model of pilot scanning of an automated cockpit and various places the pilot can look when controlling and supervising the aircraft. According to the model, our scan is driven by the salience of different areas of interest. We tend to look at bright, large areas. It's inhibited by the effort taken to move from one area to another. The farther apart they are, the more effortful and the less likely the eye is to move from one to the other. The expectancy, how likely is it that any of these areas of interest will show dynamic behavior, and how frequently are the changes in that? We look more to expected changes. And finally, the value. Certain of these display regions are not terribly important to the task, but others are extremely important. For example, the pilot looking out the window to find hazards out there. So our model predicts performance, the probability of scan to an area of interest, as a function of the salience minus the effort plus the expectancy plus the value, and each modified by a weighting that determines how important that term is to predicting scan path. Importantly, the model predicts the time of neglect of a critical visual channel. For example, in driving, it might predict how long does the driver tend to look down and keep their eyes off the highway. Or for the pilot, how often do the eyes move from an out the window view during a landing task down to the inboard of the instrument? That's a key element that we would like to know and predict. We have validated the Sieve model in a number of different experiments. Here's just one example from a single study. We're basically working with Boeing and with NASA. We looked at how 747 pilots scanned the instrument panel in flying an automated aircraft. We divided the space into several areas of interest. We had the model predict how much time people would spend looking at each area. We predicted that. We did a scanning measures and we observed. We have prediction on the y-axis, observation on the x-axis. The important point is that these points lined up very nicely across a linear function. We felt the model was well validated. We got a correlation of about 0.90 between prediction and obtained performance. But let's now move on to the second visual scanning or visual attention model. And this is a model that predicts if I'm in the process of scanning an instrument panel or scanning the world as a pilot, and suddenly there is an unexpected event that occurs in the middle of that scan pattern, such as the appearance of a rogue aircraft flying straight in front of me. Will I notice that event? Will I notice it, or how soon will I notice it or fall if my head is buried in the cockpit as a function then of the eccentricity or the distance between where I'm looking at the moment and where the event happens to appear? That we call that the eccentricity, the distance away from foveal vision. So notice the difference between the two models. This is the zoom model, or this is the Sieve model of visual scanning, which we talked about. But down below, we say what happens when my scan path is suddenly augmented by a critical event that occurs at a particular moment in time and as a particular level of eccentricity or visual angle away from where I happen to be looking at any given time. This is what we call the noticing sieve or the N-sieve model, meaning that we're adding this prediction of noticing time to a scan pattern that's predicted by sieve. The terms on the N-sieve model apply specifically to that event that is to be noticed. It says how salient is that particular event? Is it a large aircraft or a small aircraft, or maybe a tiny little drone? What is the eccentricity of that event? That is how far off the visual angle of my primary scan does that event occur, considering a warning light that may be right in the middle of my instrument panel or way out to the side when the light turns on. We're also concerned with the expectancy of the event itself. Is this a surprising event, or is it one that you might expect to occur? For a pilot going into a landing task, it's pretty surprising if a plane flies directly above them because we assume air traffic control will keep the landing approach safe from intruding traffic. And finally, we add to this the workload experienced by the observer when the event occurs. And we know from studies of change blindness, for example, that we tend to be blind to changes if our cognitive workload is very high at the time that change occurs. In fact, what N-sieve is really a model of change blindness. So the model itself says the response time to notice the event, or the miss rate, is related to a term by the eccentricity minus the salience, that is, more salient events will shorten the noticing time, minus the expectancy, more expected events will shorten the response time or lower the hit miss rate, and added to the workload, higher workload will increase the predicted noticing time. And so this just really restates the prediction time to notice an event as a function of the eccentricity from the primary viewing direction, the salience and the expectancy of that event, and the ambient workload. Well, this is a typical experiment of several that we've looked at to examine this. Here is a pilot flying an aircraft. Here is a difficult, low salient event, for example, a blimp that flies out in front of the pilot. And in studies we've done, and in a meta-analysis, we've revealed the effects of three of these variables, workload, expectancy, and eccentricity, by predicting their miss rate, by observing their miss rate, as each of these variables independently go from a low to a high value. And what's important about this validation is that looking at the effects of increasing these values, always we predict the increase, we obtain the increase, but furthermore, these lines lie very closely to this ideal prediction slope of 1.0. So we're not only predicting the size of the increase, but we're doing a pretty good job of predicting the actual value of the variable as a function of its workload, expectancy, and eccentricity. So we're back to our model chart here. We didn't really talk about these very much. I didn't talk about this one at all, but I can answer questions about it. I'm not going to cover a model of attention switching and task neglect. We just don't have time. We talked about the sieve and the NSIEV model, and I now want to talk to, I guess I would say, the most recent attention model that our team has been working with. And this is called the scan clutter trade-off model for overlaid displays. In a series of experiments that I've collaborated with Amelia Warden, we asked the question, is there an advantage of overlaying a display on top of the world beyond? When we overlay the display, we reduce the amount of scanning, but we impose clutter. Here's the conceptual example. We've got a soldier in the battlefield. They can be looking at a scene beyond, maybe trying to detect actual enemy activity, and we can present that information on an overlaid head-mounted display, or we can have the soldier look at this information on a tablet held head down. Down below, we illustrate these two different conditions. Here we're looking, is the case where you're looking at the scene or moving the eyes down to a tablet. Over here is what the soldier would see if they're looking through an HMD at the sea where there's now superimposition. As you might expect, there's a cost of scanning or visual movement when you use a head-down display. But looking at this image, there is also a cost of clutter in the sense that the view of the outside world is somewhat cluttered by the HMD information, and particularly the high, perhaps low legibility HMD information is cluttered by the outside world appearing beyond. And what we found in this research is there's generally a trade-off. The cost of scanning here is pretty much offset by the cost of clutter over here, so there's not a huge difference, really not much of a difference between these two different display configurations. However, there is a third term to the model, which defines the degree to which the user needs to integrate information on the display with information out in the scene. And if there is a high requirement for task integration, then the cost of clutter is reduced, the cost of scanning is increased. And here is an example of putting information on an HMD that's integrated with the FAR domain. This is when there is a target queuing information on the HMD that points in world reference coordinates using augmented reality to the location of a suspected target out in the scene. That's an integration task that adds to the advantage of a head-mounted display over a separated display, a separated tablet. By the way, the same design decision goes in a vehicle if we're looking at the advantage of a HUD, say on the windshield, to keeping information down on the dashboard. I won't cover these next slides. They're simply the source of development of each of these terms from a meta-analysis that Amelia Warden conducted as part of an Aspire presentation a couple of years ago. But suffice it to say that with these terms in place and with the validation of these terms, we were able to come up with a general prediction of how much of an advantage, and there usually is an advantage, there is to using an HMD, particularly when it is used to provide world referenced information that's to be integrated with the scene beyond. Well, in the remaining minutes, let me turn to the human automation interaction models. There are 3 of them. I'm going to cover this one extremely briefly, this one in a little bit more detail, and this one we will conclude our talk with. We have a model of the reliability of an alerting system. We all know that alerts often gives false alerts, false alarms that degrades its reliability. Stephen Dixon and I were interested in how the loss in reliability due to false alarms or misses impacted the accuracy of detecting, of the operator detecting of true failure using the alerting system. And we had a single factor model that related the detection accuracy to the level of reliability of the automation of the alerting system. We next turn to a model that was used to guide the design of the flight management tool in the flight cockpit. This is work I did in particular with Angie Seebach, and we have a published paper on this. And what we were trying to do is predict the accuracy of a pilot using or programming a flight management system. As I think many of you are aware of, this is a very complicated, complex automation system within the flight deck of most current transport aircraft that will essentially fly the plane itself, change its altitude, heading, and so forth. And I'll describe on the next slide a little bit more about the actual form of the model, what its different terms were. And so zooming in a little bit, this is the display for the flight management system. There is a lot of programming that goes on when the pilot needs to tell the automation how it wants to fly the airplane, when it wants to level off, when it wants to change direction, and so forth. Pretty complex display supported by a very complex set of programming logic that the pilot programs. A key element in this display is the flight mode annunciator, a system that will change when the aircraft autonomously decides to change its flight mode. And pilots have complained that this is not it's very critical to know when these changes occur, but they're not very obvious. So we developed a model called the ADAT model. And it had really three components to it. Were the different elements laid out appropriately in such a way that would minimize the overall scanning distance predicted from sieve? Would a display support the noticeability of these flight management annunciator changes? That came from the NSIEV model. And then we also added a model of menu complexity. How easy was it to go into the model, or I'm sorry, go into the system and reprogram it? We applied the model to computationally predict really the figure of merit, or how good was the conventional flight management system compared to a redesigned FMS done by Randy Mumaw out at NASA Ames, which was called the Flight Deck of a Future, and was designed to address some of these limitations of the existing FMS design. Randy did we've done our team looked at some actual data, performance data, on how long and the percent accuracy of a pilot learning to program one of these systems. And so that performance ranged from 0 transfer to 100% transfer. And we used our ADAT score, consisting of these three components, to predict the level of transfer performance. And what we found, as you can see in this simplified view graph, and we only have 2 points, the conventional system and the flight deck of the future, but both the model predicted an improvement in learning speed, and the observed experiments using professional pilots also obtained an increase in transfer. That is to say, this model of automation was validated. Automation of this one particular but very important automation system. But I turn now, in our final model that I'll talk about, is to a much more generic model of the influences on human automation team performance. And we're looking at the generic human automation team, not just an alert system, as we did up here, or just a flight management system, as we did down here, but a more generic system that could characterize any number of different automation systems. But in particular, we're looking at the difference in performance. When automation does the job it's supposed to do, we say automation is correct. And when automation fails. This is the guts of what I call the HAT influence model, features of automation and how well it affects routine versus failure performance. It's a pretty complex plate of spaghetti out here. I presented this model in full to both the Boeing folks and to the NASA folks. For you all, in the remaining few minutes I have, I want to just zoom in on certain components of this model here, in which we've examined the effects of reliability of automation, which is often related to task difficulty. The more difficult the task that we give to automation, the less reliable it comes. And for reliability, we can think back to that previous study of alert reliability, a value that we can, a term we can range from 0 to 100. And the other variable we looked at and are looking at is the transparency of automation, a hot topic for those of you that are involved in human automation interaction, is make the transparency of automation, make the automation more transparent so the human operator can see what it's doing and why it's doing that. We're looking from meta-analyses of how changes in reliability and increases in transparency can influence performance when the automation is correct, it's doing its job it was designed to do, but most critically, when the automation fails. Say the autopilot on the Tesla suddenly fails to be able to recognize a hazard in the roadway. And what our model also does is it says the relation between the properties of automation and the performance of automation is mediated by these four, well, in this case, three important cognitive variables: the trust, the dependence, and the situation awareness. And we've sort of partially validated this model, which in our computational algebraic form is performance, is a positive function of automation transparency and a positive function of automation reliability, and a possible interaction between these two. But the performance when automation fails is a positive function of transparency. We deal with automation failures better when we know what it's doing and why. But, and this is key, a negative function of the reliability. The more reliable is the automation, the more our performance suffers when automation fails. This is the model we are currently working on, and I'm collaborating with a team from George Mason University to help populate the model. But we're also using it to help predict trust, dependency, and situation awareness. So let me conclude this talk and give ourselves some, we've got a fair amount of time for some questions here, by the notion that, at least in my view, the algebraic models are simple, they're understandable to researchers and designers beyond our modeling community. So many of the computational models of the process are accurate, but they're fairly complex. They use a lot of software, and a lot of the programs are relatively complex, and sometimes they're not entirely intuitive to a layperson or to a designer that really wants to just know what's the model manipulating and how important are the factors. I would argue that these models capture effects of design parameters affecting performance. By capture, I mean they're valid. These validity measures, the correlations, are far from perfect. That is, our correlation between prediction and observed performance is oftentimes considerably less than 1.0. In fact, it's always less than 1.0. But for our efforts to validate it, we find that the correlation is about, oftentimes around in the range of 0.7, which means the model is accounting for about 50% of the variance in performance. And that's good enough, oftentimes, to identify, before a system is built, what may be a particularly bad design. And we can recommend to system designers, don't even consider evaluating this, a certain factor that contributes to a very poor design, before the product development proceeds, or even the simulation of the product begins to be in place. But the last point I want to make is clearly the models need data to populate them. Going back up here with our summary, let's see. Let me go back to the original one. If we look across these models plus the automation models, some of them have a lot of data to support them, particularly the Sieve model, the N-Sieve model. Some were beginning to collect more data. And as far as the automation models are concerned, I can go back here. We're getting a lot of data up here. We just have one experiment to validate this model, and this is the model that I'm out in the field desperately trying to harvest as much data I have to come up with reliable measures of those terms and their coefficients. So with that, I conclude the talk, and let's see, yeah, there we go. Conclude the talk, ask for questions, suggest that if any of you want to contact me individually, you can email me at either of these two email addresses. And I do want to notify or notice that in these PowerPoints will be available to be shared with you, and B, on the PowerPoints itself, within those tables, there are source documents for each of the models I've described, the reference documents.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. Well, we have several questions. It's very popular. And I just read through and then just made a group by maybe roughly three categories. So maybe for about the remaining about 15 minutes, I'm happy to just share the questions. So I just can see that three groups. One group of questions about modeling just process, and second group is more about validation, and third, application side. So let me maybe first there are a couple of questions related to modeling process. I see that so among the various models that you just showed to us, that there are variables. Sometimes you have sieve model, for example, there are four variables or factors. How did you select those factors among various possible factors? For example, the factors could be some environmental related, or sometimes it could be some psychological or physiological related factors. So among those multiple just variables, how did you come up with four or a few factors in your
Yeah,
model?
a real good question, because as we know in human cognition and human system interaction, there are probably hundreds of things that affect the level of performance. I'd say we target two things. A, there are factors that a designer can do something about. So a designer can definitely decide whether to incorporate an auditory display or a visual display. B, I just get a sense, and this is where the meta-analysis is so important, which ones account for a substantial amount of variance in performance. And beyond that, it's a kind of a judgment call of, how many factors are admitted to the club of in a particular predictive model. Yeah. And the idea is that, there's no magic number four. In fact, sometimes it's one, two, or three. I wouldn't like to go much beyond four in general, but that's, you know, it just becomes more complex to apply. And you have less certainty about how these different factors interact the more there are, all the different combination of interactions. But it's a judgment call.
Mm-mm.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. And then for modeling stage, so well, it's the talk is based on algebraic equation approach. So in this era of artificial intelligence, or we are so overwhelmed with a lot of complex mathematics. So then how could you just verify that this algebraic equation is the best model as opposed to other complex mathematical just equations?
What was the last question? How do I what?
How do you know that this algebraic based equation is the best model as opposed to other
It's
quadratic or
it's
exponential
not it's not going to be the best model, but it's the simplest. It's the
simplest?
easiest to use. And I use model parsimony as an important criteria for selling a model. And I think many of my colleagues in industry find it's useful to be able, the actual industry that's making things, not the industry that's doing the research on it as much. It's useful to get a handle on simple performance parameters. So, but I also want to emphasize, and I didn't mention this before, our algebraic models in some of these models are also have an underlying computational version. For example, both sieve and the model of task switching, there is a more complex process model underlying that, and we can run that. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. And then the third group of questions is about model validation. So there was particular question about correlation, but I think just in the last slide, they just covered that the R of around at least 0.7 or not ideally 1, but so the particular question was that what specific value of R should be to sell your models. And also, and then for, yeah. Maybe just we can start from there.
It's a judgment call, and I
Judgment.
threw that number of a correlation of 0.7 up there, A, because it's pretty, because it's 7 squared, 0.7 squared is 0.5 or 0.49, which means you're accounting for half the variance in flight in performance. So, but it is kind of a judgment call. The key thing, yeah, it's a judgment call, and but I do want to point to the value of the correlation itself because it's so heavily dependent on the number of data points, the sample size, that I want to pay just as much attention to what the graph looks like and how close the points lie to a straight line. Yeah. So the value of the correlation matters, but the significance of the correlation doesn't matter that much. But the
That's
value of the correlation 0.7, is how close it lies to the straight line. And then what you can do, let me actually, if I can, let's see, how do I get back to my uh, slides? I'm still sharing, right? Yeah,
Mhm.
I need to see them. Hmm. Yeah, here we go. I'm going to put this on. Yeah, this is the key element. Can you see this slide?
Mhm.
Yeah. What we're really interested in here, there are only four different conditions, but the correlation is pretty high. What we'd like to do from this, for example, if we look at our data, is say, hey, this point is predicted, this particular condition is predicted, maybe it's use of a head down display under high visual workload, is both predicted and found to be really bad. So we would tell the designers or the consumers or who's ever developing the system of the field, don't even consider this, take it out of your realm of development. And that's going to simplify their task in trying to optimize what's the best system.
Yes, yeah, that's the question about validation. And then the last group of questions about application. Well, these days well, for this modeling, can we apply this model to design requirements such as DoD or requirements standard like MIL 1472? I think this is DoD's design guideline. So is there any case or examples that this kind of human performance modeling could be applied to those design guideline or standards?
It could be applied.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or has been applied. I'm not sure to the extent it has been applied,
Mm-hmm.
but certainly, I mean, as an example, well, this is not DoD, but this is FAA. FAA is very much looking at the question of head-mounted displays, uh, not just for general aviation, but for commercial applications. And so you're going to put an FMD or an HMD, allow pilots to wear an HMD. There may be guidelines that the FAA would like to propose on how cluttered that display should be or can be and
Mm-hmm.
still be usable. So there would be an example where we would use a model to provide guidance to the FAA of how they can certify different vendors of an HMD for the cockpit. Yeah.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. So we have actually a lot of questions. I think I just tried to just make a group among those about 23 questions. We'll see if there are any recent questions. So okay. So or is there can also participants also turn on the Or not? Okay, we'll see. I think roughly just those three group of questions answer most of the questions in this Q&A. If you have any other questions, you can also email Chris or me, and I'm happy to just pass over. And there's a last question. A lot of audience were interested in your slide. So could we just see the slides after this talk?
Yeah, it's the actual PowerPoint is too big for me to mail out of my tiny wee little computer here. But as Stephanie said, I'm going to put it in a PDF, send it to her, and then she will make it available
Yeah.
to all the rest of you.
Yes, so
Yeah.
PDF or PowerPoint would be available after this webinar. So for those who registered, then you will have access to this webinar records and
Yeah.
recording and slides. Yeah. So
In worst case, you can put those two parts together as a single PowerPoint, even though it's not quite the final PowerPoint, but you at least have it in your possession, and you have a big computer, not a teeny tiny little one that I'm sure you could
yes,
reassemble it and send it off to Stephanie.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, awesome. Thank you so much, Chris Wickens, for our first webinar of our TG, Human Performance Modeling TG. So I really appreciate your time and efforts, and also it's a great start of this year. So I hope that just Chris and Stephanie and then the audience have a wonderful the rest of the day. And then, well, for the future webinar or other events, our Human Performance Modeling TGs planning multiple fun event in the future. So yeah, thank you for interest and your stay tuned. So thank you everybody. See you in another opportunity.
Thank you all for attending. I wish I knew who you all were, but I guess I can find out eventually and see if they're friendly faces in the crowd. So good luck, and hopefully we'll see you all at Aspire in Las Vegas next year. Not Las Vegas, I'm sorry. We know.
You know, yeah.
Yeah, it's Nevada. It's Nevada, small state. They're all alike, all those cities out there. All right. Bye
Right.
bye.